The observer stands before the dim light of his office window, a place where silence has its own heartbeat. The night hums faintly outside, yet inside the room, the air feels dense, deliberate. He begins not with words, but with a pause so long it feels alive. Silence, he says finally, is not the absence of sound, is the presence of pressure. He recalls his first experiment years ago, a therapy session that began as ordinary as any other. Two people seated across from each other, a husband and wife on the verge of collapse. Their voices had been weapons, each sentence sharpened by months of resentment. So he asked them to stop speaking. For 5 full minutes. No interruptions. No explanations. Only the sound of their breathing. At first it was bearable. Then unbearable. The husband's hands twitched, searching for control. The wife's eyes darted to the clock, begging for escape. In that vacuum of sound, something primal surfaced, the need to fill the void, to dominate it. When silence grows heavy, truth begins to leak out from the cracks. The observer realized then, silence doesn't calm mind, it corners it. In the stillness between words, the human mind begins to project guilt, fear, desire. What people can't hear, they imagine. What they imagine, they fear. And what they fear, they try to control. He turns to his notes, speaking now like a surgeon describing anatomy. Every conversation, he writes, is an exchange of control. The one who speaks tries to lead, but the one who listens, the one who waits, dictates the tempo. He pauses, letting the idea sink in. Imagine, he says, a conversation where one person remains silent longer than expected. Watch how the other begins to fidget, over-explain, confess. The silence becomes unbearable because it reflects back everything they're trying to hide. He remembers a case from years ago, a young executive accused of embezzlement. During questioning, she spoke rapidly, defending herself against accusations no one had yet made. The silence of a room became her undoing. She filled it with guilt before anyone demanded it. That is the secret. Those who cannot endure silence expose themselves through noise. The observer moves closer to the microphone on his desk, his tone lowering. Silence, he says, is not weakness. It is containment. It is the art of letting others reveal themselves while you remain unseen. He explains that silence in human interaction operates like gravity, invisible, but always exerting pull. When you speak less, others move toward you, desperate for reaction, validation, approval. They interpret your quietness as judgment, mystery, or superiority. And that interpretation gives you power. This is what Machiavelli meant when he wrote that men must either be caressed or destroyed. Silence does both. It comforts the strong and destroys the fragile. He leans back, eyes half closed, as if listening to something far away. Every leader, every manipulator, every lover who truly understands control, he murmurs, knows the weight of silence. They know when to let the world speak for them. Then he lowers his voice, a whisper now. But silence is not mercy. It demands a price. To hold your tongue is to hold your breath beneath water. Eventually, something must rise to the surface. He closes his journal. The clock ticks once. The air tightens again. Those who cannot stand silence, he repeats softly, will always reveal themselves first. He lets the words fade into the void, leaving only the faint hum of electricity. The silence returns heavier now, as though testing the listener. Outside, the night deepens, and with it, the question that leads into his next revelation. If silence reveals truth, then what happens when the truth itself learns to stay silent? The observer flips to a new page in his journal, the faint scratch of his pen slicing through the stillness. The words from his last note linger in the air like smoke. If silence reveals truth, then what happens when truth itself learns to stay silent? He exhales and begins the next case. Her name was Lena. When she first entered his office, she didn't look broken, she looked hollow. Her eyes didn't dart or weep. They simply observed. Her silence wasn't fragile. It was weaponized. Her partner, on the other hand, filled the room with explanations. Every word he spoke was an attempt to rewrite the story, to frame himself as the victim of her distance. She doesn't talk to me, he said. She just stares. She shuts down, makes me feel like the bad one. The observer listened. But more importantly, he watched. Every time Lena's partner spoke, her expression didn't change. No reaction, no anger, no tears. Just calm presence, and it terrified him. The more silent she became, the louder his guilt tried to fill the space. The more she withheld emotion, the more desperate he became to provoke it. It was then that the observer wrote one of his most important notes. Emotional silence is not avoidance. It is a mirror, and the unstable mind cannot bear to see itself. When people are confronted by emotional stillness, they project. The insecure project their fears. The manipulative project their lies. And the guilty, they project their own crimes. Silence becomes the glass that reflects the image they can no longer distort. In the following sessions, the observer began to notice a pattern. Lena never defended herself. She didn't argue, explain, or justify. She simply held the silence, letting her partner's words turn into confessions disguised as accusations. When he accused her of being cold, his voice trembled, not with anger but with fear. Fear of losing control. Fear of exposure. That was when the observer intervened. He asked Lena one question. Why don't you respond when he blames you? She tilted her head slightly, her first movement in minutes. Because he doesn't want answers, she said softly. He wants noise. He needs my reaction to make his lies sound real. The observer felt the weight of her statement. It was not defiance, it was awareness. The kind Machiavelli once described as the knowledge that silence speaks more truth than protest. In his analysis notes later, the observer wrote, "The manipulator thrives on feedback. Take away his audience, and his narrative collapses under its own noise." Weeks later, Lena's partner stopped attending therapy. He claimed she was impossible to communicate with. But the truth was simpler. He could no longer perform. Without her reactions, his power dissolved. Lena remained. Quiet, calm, unshaken. Her silence was not submission, it was clarity. The observer turned off the recorder that day and stared at the empty chair where her partner once sat. It was then that he realized the human ego cannot survive in the presence of silence. It craves validation, conflict, and response, anything to prove it exists. And so, in silence, Lena had done what few ever manage. She dismantled manipulation without raising her voice. The observer's voice lowers, a dark cadence filling the air. Silence is the mirror where the manipulator sees his reflection and breaks. He lets the words settle, the echo cutting through the dimness. Then, almost in a whisper, he adds, "But not all who fall to silence are corrupt. Some are consumed by it." He closes the file marked Case 47, Lena, and his eyes drift toward the next folder, its label half erased by time. The Machiavellian equation. And as he opens it, the light in the room shifts, colder, more analytical. The lesson that follows will not be about survival, but about strategy. The folder, marked the Machiavellian equation, lay heavy on the observer's desk, its corners frayed from years of handling. Inside were not reports or diagnoses, but fragments of philosophy, notes that blurred the line between psychology and strategy. He traced one line written long ago: "He who controls reaction controls reality." Lena's silence had proven this truth in practice, but Machiavelli had whispered it centuries earlier. The observer understood now that emotional control was not passivity, it was design. And like every form of design, it followed a structure, a pattern of cause and consequence. He began the recording. "In every human exchange," he said, "there are only two forces at play: impulse and interpretation. The one who acts on impulse becomes predictable. The one who controls interpretation becomes powerful." He looked out at the city below, a living organism of noise and reaction, people arguing, scrolling, proving, performing. The modern world, he thought, had perfected distraction but forgotten composure. Every emotion was broadcast, every feeling monetized. Outrage was power's favorite currency. Machiavelli's unspoken code was simple, yet deadly. To rule emotion, you must first deny it the right to rule you. He recalled a case study involving a corporate strategist named Elias, a man who never raised his voice, never rushed a sentence. His subordinates feared him not because of his authority, but because they could never read him. Boardroom confrontations that would ignite others left him untouched. Even in chaos, he was still. One of his rivals once shouted across the table, veins straining, trying to provoke him. Elias only smiled, not with arrogance, but with awareness. Within minutes, the rival's words began to unravel into contradiction, the emotion consuming its own logic. Elias didn't need to respond. Silence did it for him. The observer analyzed that moment. He wrote, "Stillness is not absence. It is architecture. It gives shape to the chaos of others." He had once believed dominance required presence, speech, assertion, influence. But now he saw the deeper truth: the calmest mind wins not by force, but by stillness. Machiavelli understood this instinctively. In his letters, he hinted that princes and leaders must appear emotional to inspire loyalty, yet remain detached enough to make merciless decisions. The mask of emotion without the burden of it, that was the real art. The observer's voice darkens. In our age, he says, we have inverted that balance. People display emotion to prove authenticity, forgetting that control, not honesty, shapes power. He leaned closer to the microphone, his tone like a confession. Every time you react, you surrender the frame of reality to someone else. And the one who dictates the frame dictates the game. Elias once told the observer something he never forgot. If I lose my temper, I lose the room. That sentence became the foundation of the Machiavellian equation, a psychological formula hidden beneath centuries of strategy. Reaction equals control lost. Composure equals power retained. It is not cruelty that gives one dominance, but detachment. The power to watch a storm without becoming part of it. The observer closes Elias's file, his fingers resting on the final page, a reflection that feels almost prophetic. The calm mind does not need to win every battle. It only needs to survive every test. He looks up at the empty room, the low hum of silence wrapping around him again. The lessons of Machiavelli, he realizes, were never about manipulation alone, they were about evolution. His voice softens into a near whisper, guiding the listener deeper into the abyss. The calmest mind wins not by force, but by stillness. A pause. Then, almost like an echo. But what happens when stillness is turned into a weapon, not of defense, but of domination? The city outside the observer's window pulsed with artificial light, towers glowing like circuitry, each window a fragment of human ambition. Beneath that glow, another kind of war was unfolding. Not with bullets or blood, but with glances, messages, and silence. He turned a page in his journal labeled Case 63, the Meridian Corporation. A perfect example of how the Machiavellian equation operated not in thrones or empires, but in offices, among people who thought they were civilized. It began with a promotion. One man's rise meant another's slow erasure. Jonathan, a manager known for his charm, had orchestrated his climb through compliments and performance. But when the board chose Elias, the same man from the observer's earlier study, Jonathan's smile faltered. What followed was not open conflict. It was silence sharpened into strategy. Emails began to go unanswered, meetings filled with long, deliberate pauses. Jonathan avoided direct accusation but left space for suspicion to grow. The observer, brought in later as an analyst, described it as psychological oxygen deprivation. The power didn't shift through confrontation. It shifted through composure. Jonathan's aggression burned quickly. Elias's restraint burned quietly. In time, it consumed the entire floor. The observer explains, when words vanish, people begin to imagine meaning. The less Elias said, the more others projected. They filled the silence with fear, with guilt, with conspiracies of their own making. He observed how Elias mastered the rhythm of the room, not by interruption, but by withholding. In board meetings, he would allow others to speak themselves into exhaustion, only responding with a single, precise question. Are you sure? That sentence, dropped into silence, dismantled entire arguments. It wasn't an accusation, it was an opening, one that exposed insecurity, like light through cracked glass. The observer noted in his files. Power speaks softly, but listens loudly. Those who fill the silence become predictable. Those who control it become indispensable. He remembered one critical day, the presentation that would decide the company's future. Jonathan had prepared a dazzling speech, filled with figures and charisma. Elias, in contrast, said almost nothing. He let the board drown in data and excitement before calmly presenting two sentences that contradicted Jonathan's entire argument. He did not raise his voice. He didn't need to. The silence that followed made his words echo louder than any applause. Within a week, Jonathan was reassigned. Within a month, forgotten. The observer leaned back in his chair, staring into the tape recorder. That, he said, is the anatomy of a quiet war. No shouting, no blood, only control of rhythm. He continued, we live in an age where noise is mistaken for strength. But power, true power, lies in pacing. The one who slows the tempo commands the symphony. Every word spoken in haste reveals motive, every silence design. The calm mind manipulates not through force, but through timing, the unseen weapon Machiavelli never named, yet always understood. The observer's voice softened. Silence doesn't end conversations, he said. It decides who truly controls them. He turned off the recorder, but the hum of electricity filled the space like a lingering thought. Outside, the skyline blinked, office towers alive with whispers of unseen negotiations, silent wars fought in glass rooms. He wrote one final line before closing the file. Those who master silence do not fight battles. They write histories. He paused, letting the sentence settle, then looked at the next folder on his desk, this one marked in red ink. The sound of guilt. His tone dropped lower, almost reflective. Some wars, he murmured, are not fought against others, but against the echoes of one's own conscience. The observer's next tape began with the faint click of an audio recorder and the low hum of a fluorescent light. Case 77, he said, his voice almost a whisper. Silence as extraction. The confession that speaks without words. The scene, a dimly lit interrogation room, the kind that smells faintly of cold metal and regret. 2 chairs, 1 table, and between them, an invisible current of power. On one side sat Detective Rourke, a man whose face was carved by years of reading liars. On the other, Calvin, a suspect whose eyes flickered between arrogance and dread. The murder had been brutal. No witnesses. No clear motive. Only inconsistencies, small fractures in Calvin's story. Most detectives would have broken him through repetition, through relentless questioning. Rourke chose something else. He began the session with one question. Where were you after the call? Calvin answered too quickly, his words tumbling out in a practiced rhythm. Then, silence. Rourke didn't respond. He didn't nod. Didn't write. Didn't even blink. He just stared, the way a surgeon studies a wound before cutting. 10 seconds. 30. A full minute. The air thickened. The silence wasn't passive, it was invasive. It crawled under Calvin's skin, pressed against his heartbeat, filled the empty spaces where lies tried to hide. Calvin cleared his throat. I told you I was at home. Still no response. Rourke leaned back, folding his arms, his expression calm, too calm. The ticking clock grew louder. Each tick sounded like judgment. Each second stretched into something unbearable. Finally, Calvin shifted. His foot began to tap, a nervous code the silence translated easily. He spoke again, softer now. I didn't even know she was home that night. That was the first crack. The observer paused the tape and wrote. When pressed by noise, the liar defends. When pressed by silence, he reveals. Rourke had mastered the art of psychological vacuum. By refusing to speak, he forced Calvin's mind to echo its own guilt. Every word Calvin had rehearsed began to collapse under the weight of stillness. The confession didn't come as a breakdown. It came as exhaustion. I didn't mean to, Calvin whispered finally, the words trembling into the stale air. She wouldn't stop screaming. No threats. No raised voice. Just silence, steady, suffocating, absolute. Rourke didn't even move when the words fell. He let them exist, raw and irreversible. Then, with the quiet authority of a man who already knew the truth, he said, You've been talking to yourself for an hour, Calvin. I just listened. The observer rewound that moment several times. It fascinated him, not the confession, but the method. Rourke's silence had not been empty. It was a mirror, forcing the killer to confront his reflection until it screamed. He recorded his thoughts. There is a threshold where the human mind confuses silence with judgment. The guilty cannot endure it. They seek sound to escape the echo of their own conscience. As the recording ended, the observer turned off the machine and stared at the dim glow of his desk lamp. When words fail, he said softly, silence becomes the loudest confession. He closed the file and let the sentence linger in the quiet. Somewhere outside his office, a siren wailed in the distance, a reminder that guilt always finds its way back to noise. But the observer wasn't finished. There was a deeper layer he needed to examine, not silence as a weapon, but silence as transformation. What happens when the one who masters it begins to lose themselves inside it? He turned to a new folder marked Case 81, The Void Within. His eyes narrowed. This, he murmured, is where silence stops being control and becomes hunger. The rain outside the observer's window fell like static, rhythmic, endless, cleansing nothing. He pressed play on the next recording. The label read Case 81, The Void Within. His tone, quieter than before, hinted at something personal. This case, he began, was not about death in the physical sense. It was the slow decay of a soul starved of sound, of touch, of acknowledgement. Love, when twisted by silence, becomes indistinguishable from cruelty. He spoke of Elena and Marcus, 2 people who once seemed inseparable, a couple so in tune they could finish each other's thoughts. But somewhere between affection and obsession, the music changed. It started with small silences. A missed reply. A delayed message. A glance that lingered too long on a screen instead of a face. Marcus began to withdraw not through words, but through their absence. When Elena confronted him, he smiled faintly and said, "You're imagining things." The observer paused, his voice low. That phrase, a manipulator's lullaby. It doesn't silence sound, it silences certainty. Weeks passed. Every night, Elena waited for his voice, the warmth that once anchored her. But silence came instead, deliberate and cruel. He withheld not affection but attention, knowing she would fill that void with self-doubt. The observer wrote in his notes, "In emotional warfare, silence becomes the perfect weapon. It leaves no trace, no word to analyze, no act to forgive. Only the echo of what once was." Elena tried to fight it. She spoke louder, reached further, apologized for things she never did. The more she reached, the quieter Marcus became. He had discovered the secret pleasure of control, that by simply doing nothing, he could dictate everything. When she finally broke, it wasn't with a scream. It was with a whisper. "Please, just say something." But Marcus didn't. He sat in stillness, his eyes fixed on her, detached and observing. The moments stretched into eternity, and in that eternity, something inside her cracked. The observer's voice grew softer, almost mournful. Love can endure anger. It can even endure lies. But it cannot survive indifference. Silence kills slowly, because it lets hope die one unanswered moment at a time. He turned the page of his file, and continued. When Elena left, she thought she was free. But silence followed her, not his anymore, but hers. She stopped answering calls. Stopped reaching out. What was once weaponized against her had become her armor. He looked down at his hands, then admitted, barely audibly, "Many victims of emotional manipulation don't escape it. They inherit it." The recording paused. The rain outside seemed louder now, as though echoing the sorrow that filled the room. To love someone who weaponizes silence, the observer whispered, is to drown in invisible water. You don't realize you're suffocating until you can't breathe. He turned off the recorder, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was heavy, alive, the kind that clings to the walls long after words fade. He finally stood, pacing to the window. In his reflection, he saw his own outline, pale, unreadable. For a moment, he seemed to recognize something familiar in the void he had just described. "Sometimes," he murmured, "we don't study silence to understand others, we do it to understand ourselves." He looked back toward his desk, where one final file waited, darker, older, unmarked. The observer reached for it slowly. His tone hardened again, returning to the analyst's calm precision. "This last case," he said, "was the one that taught me the final truth, that silence, once mastered, no longer serves control, it consumes it." The observer sat before a wall of flickering monitors, each screen alive with the noise of modern life, messages flashing, voices overlapping, digital chaos masquerading as connection. He didn't need to turn up the volume to feel its weight. The noise was everywhere, woven into the bloodstream of civilization. He began to record, his voice steady, detached, yet edged with warning. "Society no longer speaks," he said. "It reacts. The mind has been replaced by the echo." The screens showed people scrolling, typing, posting, performing. Every silence was filled instantly, with music, laughter, outrage, or distraction. Stillness had become unbearable. In the rush to never be alone, the world had made noise a drug. The fear of silence, the observer noted, is the fear of the self. Because in quiet the mask falls, and what's left is the truth. He recalled the early experiments, groups of participants left alone in silent rooms for extended periods. Most couldn't last more than 15 minutes before creating sound, humming, tapping, whispering to no one. One subject broke into tears. Another begged to be let out. They weren't afraid of the dark, the observer explained. They were afraid of what spoke back to them inside the dark. He leaned back, his eyes catching his reflection in the black glass of a monitor. This is why emotional silence is power. The world is ruled by reaction. Politicians provoke it, corporations monetize it, lovers manipulate it. The one who does not react, he said slowly, becomes ungovernable. He recalled a memory from his fieldwork, a protest he had observed years ago. In the crowd, thousands shouted, their anger a collective symphony of chaos. But one man stood still. No sign, no chant, no motion. The police moved around him, confused, unsettled. His calm was defiance. His silence screamed louder than every megaphone. Silence, the observer wrote later that night, is the last rebellion. He turned off the screens one by one. The room dimmed until only his desk lamp remained. The sound of the world faded into a low hum, like the heartbeat of something distant and dying. "When the world forgets how to be silent," he said softly, "those who remember become gods." The words lingered, and for the first time, the observer allowed himself a rare pause. Power, after all, wasn't just in understanding silence, it was in enduring it. The stillness stretched on, swallowing even the hum of the city outside. But then he frowned, because in that stillness, something unexpected stirred, not peace, but presence. A subtle unease, a feeling that the silence he had mastered was now studying him in return. He wrote in the margin of his notes, "The more one listens into the void, the more the void begins to listen back." He stared at that line, the ink still wet, realizing that he had crossed an invisible line. The silence that once empowered him now felt alive. Watching. Waiting. He closed the notebook abruptly and turned off the recorder. The desk lamp flickered once, twice, and went out. For a long moment, there was nothing. Then, in the darkness, the observer's voice returned, quieter, shaken, yet resolute. "Every civilization fears silence," he whispered, "because silence doesn't obey." A pause, then a deep breath. "But there's one more truth I've never recorded. One that even I hesitate to speak. The silence we control is never ours, it's borrowed." His tone shifted, part philosopher, part confessor. "And when it decides to take itself back, the world will remember what it means to listen again." The recordings that followed were quieter, almost ghost-like. The observer's voice, usually precise and clinical, had softened into something unfamiliar: solitude. He began this phase of his study with a simple intention: 40 days without speech. No phone, no conversation, no sound except the breath that moved through him and the ticking of time itself. The experiment, he said, was not scientific. It was surgical. He moved into a secluded cabin far from the city, a place stripped of Wi-Fi, mirrors, and memory. Each morning he woke before sunrise, writing without words. Only symbols, gestures, and thoughts. He sought not silence from the world, but silence within. The first 3 days, he recorded in his field notes, were mechanical withdrawal. The mind still demanded noise, imaginary conversations, phantom music, the ghost of connection. "I was detoxing from sound." By the 7th day, his body had adjusted, but his mind had begun to betray him. Thoughts became louder, looping, relentless. Regret replayed itself like a broken tape. Every silence invited an old echo. He realized that most people don't fear silence, they fear memory. He wrote, "When you strip away distraction, you meet what you've been avoiding. And most of what we avoid is ourselves." By the 20th day, something shifted. He stopped craving noise. The observer described it as a psychological inversion, a point where silence stopped being absence and became presence. Every movement, every flicker of wind, every drop of rain felt amplified, alive. He sat for hours watching ants crawl over a discarded leaf, listening to the rhythm of his own pulse. He noticed how his breath aligned with the sway of the trees, a small but undeniable harmony. "Nature," he wrote, "is fluent in silence. It doesn't argue, it doesn't plead. It endures." But solitude had another layer, one darker, more revealing. Around the 30th day, he began to sense a fracture in perception. Without the structure of language, time itself lost form. Hours bled into each other. The world no longer spoke, it stared back. He saw in every shadow the reflection of a truth long hidden by words. Human desire and fear are twins, born of the same silence. Every ambition is rooted in loneliness. Every love, a plea to be understood before the final quiet. He wrote in his journal, the letters shaky. Without words, every lie dissolves. The self we build collapses. And what remains is something neither beautiful nor monstrous, just true. By the 40th day, the observer no longer recognized the voice in his own head. It wasn't judgmental or rational, it was ancient, whispering truths without language. He described it as the silence speaking back. When he finally returned to civilization, the noise of the world struck him like violence. Conversations fell hollow. The endless chatter of news, phones, laughter, it all seemed desperate, like a collective denial of something sacred and terrifying. He ended his final recording that night, his voice steady but distant. In the absence of words, he said, the truth stands naked. Every illusion dies there, power, pride, even purpose. What's left is the raw pulse of being. And maybe that is what we fear the most. He paused, exhaling softly. Silence was never emptiness, he whispered. It was the mirror of everything. The tape clicked to an end. For a long time, the room was still. Then, almost imperceptibly, another sound, not from a recording, but from somewhere behind the microphone, a breath. One that didn't belong to the observer. And then a voice, faint, distant, familiar. You've been watched too.